Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, I am joined by the fantabulous Sam Paisley. Thank you so much for joining me today, Sam.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. People know me, so why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and give us a little snippet of your book?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Sam Paisley. As you can see, I'm the author of the Elements of Time series. Book one is out as of July of last year. There you go. It's right there. Let me see if I can. It sometimes disappears on
We
me.
we got to show off this beautiful cover.
Here, yeah, I can duck down. Um,
There you go.
yeah, so it is. So I mean, a little bit about me. This is my first. It's my debut novel, and there will be more on the way. This is the first of a trilogy. So books two and books three are planned. They are in process. For anyone who hates when a series doesn't end, this one has a very definite conclusion and a very definite arc that is pre-planned. And though this is my debut novel, I have been writing it for the last decade, so I'm certain we can talk about that in much more detail. But
Yes.
it's draft. This is draft 7 of of this book, so took a while to get there. But a little bit about the book. Um, it I best described as Star Wars meets Avatar: The Last Airbender, with a lot of inspiration from Stargate SG-1 and Supernatural. It is a story about destiny, personal responsibility, with a couple interwoven magic systems. So not to get too spoilery, but elemental magic is a huge part of it, and
Mm.
then space-time magic is a big element of it as well. And it's a science fantasy adventure, so it's meant to be fun, it's meant to be entertaining, and it's meant to have a lot of depth under the surface, theme and symbology, and making sure that every element of the story built into the themes I was trying to tell was really
Mm.
important to me. But first and foremost, my goal was to write something that someone can read and say, wow, that was fun. And then a couple days later, they're like, huh, oh, yeah, that makes sense. So
I
that's
love it.
that's the pitch.
I love that you mixed all of those forms of inspiration. Avatar: The Last Airbender, Star Wars, Stargate. I That's a lot. I love it. We have some lovely folks here with us as well. Tim, a fellow Canuck, welcome. ZK, welcome. Good to see you. Scott,
Got
always a pleasure.
we got the whole Canada crew on this.
Yeah. Look at us go. And yes, absolutely a beautiful cover. Thanks so much for stopping in. And look at that, we got a fan club going on for you. Yes, let's get the Canucks going. So, I just based on the pitch that you talked about, I actually want to ask something that is I find fascinating when you blend fantasy and sci-fi,
Yeah.
right? How did you find that? Because you said this was your seventh draft. You spent 10 years writing this, and you're blending 2 different genres. How was that for you?
Yeah, so I found it very natural, and I think the reason being because I grew up with like I actually have the VHSs in my basement that I watched as a kid of the
I love
original
it.
Star Wars trilogy. And as in where I am right now, they are currently almost directly beneath me. And to me, Star Wars is and has always been a fantasy, science fantasy at best, but
Mm,
um, it has like a sci-fi veneer, but underneath it
mm,
has a pretty clear magic system and is a fantasy realm. So the distinction for me between science fiction and fantasy is that science fiction typically deals more with the nuts and bolts of the science around it and um, exploring ideas and themes through a science lens if we were to kind of extend our understanding of science. So like Star Trek would be much harder sci-fi, let's say, versus fantasy, which tends to deal more in magic. I heard a really interesting, it might have been a meme. I think it was a meme. But it said the difference between fantasy and science fiction is that the currency in science fiction is credits, and the currency in fantasy is coin. Basically, it. So
Behind every meme, there is a sliver of truth.
exactly. Um, so yeah, so the blending for me, like I've always been fascinated by science and have never been like in university. I discovered I am not a math person. I
Mm.
thought I was in high school, but it turns out high school math is just much easier than high school university math. But I love science, so like studying astronomy and just different scientific principles without actually diving into the mathematics behind it. Um, and kind of do a similar thing here in the book where you can there are certain scientific principles that are fascinating to talk about and to research, like
Mm.
dark matter, again, astronomy without having to know the science of it, gravity, basic things that are in our everyday life,
Mhm.
and easy enough to blend into a fantasy realm. So a big part of the elemental magic system, which centers around the four Greek elements: air, fire, water, earth. Um, those are considered spatial uh, magic, for lack of a better term, versus temporal
Okay.
time. So right there and then, just by that kind of classification, you're already into talking about space time, which is science, right? So
Yeah.
the blend came fairly easy, and I think it's because a lot of my inspirations, I would, Stargate is closer to science fiction than fantasy, but the last couple seasons are super fantasy heavy. Uh,
Right.
so a lot of my inspirations, I think, just naturally bled into that mix.
Interesting. I love it. I love it. It can be such an in-depth topic, right? Because every author, every storyteller is going to take their own world and their own ideas of that blended genre into various forms and depths, right? So it's fascinating to hear your perspective on it, having spent so much time in your world and building it, that um, the how you make it sound a lot easier to blend. It probably is to put on paper, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't think any writer is ever going to tell you it's easy to do to do anything, but um, I had uh, I think that in today's media landscape, for lack of a better term, because there's been such a proliferation of sci-fi and fantasy over the last 40, 50 years, things kind of blend together, like where you put if I think of one of my favorite movies of all time, Back to the Future,
Mm.
where would you put time travel on the scale of fantasy versus science fiction, right? So
Oh,
they're depending, like if you're talking about faster than light travel, you can talk about that, like I'll use a friend of mine, Brian Wilson, the Forsaken Planet. He does faster than light travel with his magic system Solera. My hand is
mm.
disappearing. um, but you could also, that's very much fantasy. It's very much magic. And then kind of in the middle of that is hyperdrives, right? You're in Star
Right.
Wars, you use the hyperdrive, do the calculations, but it doesn't go into so much detail. And then
Mm.
you have things like The Expanse, or other, harder science fiction that really talk about the mechanics of faster than light travel and how you would, in a practical sense, be able to achieve that technology even though we're not there.
Right. Yeah,
Uh,
Star Trek does all that too. Yeah.
exactly. So I think it just depends on, like, you can take not any, but many science fiction or fantasy elements, like even fantasy, if you have a magic system, in a
Mm.
lot, what Brandon Sanderson does well is he takes his magic system and he oftentimes treats them like science. Uh,
Right.
and then again, like where are you on that spectrum? So I think, the reason I call it a science fantasy is because the book, a lot of it takes place, let's say, on other planets, and I try to give um, reasonable explanations to the magic system. And there's a lot of Star Wars influence, from things like the Jedi. So people's brains understand that as science fiction. But
Right.
to me, like let's say, for example, there's a location in the setting with like flying ships, floating mountains. I give a sciency, like a wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, hand wavy explanation of how it works. But it makes sense within the universe itself. So
Right.
to me, that's like science fantasy, but I guess it just depends on how you're defining things and to find that blend.
It depends on how far you're willing to explain the wibbly wobble.
Yeah, exactly.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Tim here says he found his 25th anniversary VHS versions of the originals. That's exciting.
Last night, oh, perfect timing.
And yeah, someday we'll all wield Solara Bibliotheory.
Yeah. Well,
So
we'll be sure to let Brian know that we're all desperate for his magic system to be real.
there you go. Just snap your fingers, right? Should be that
Exactly.
easy. So, in terms of your own passion for stories, where did that start?
Yeah, I think I was lucky enough to be one of those kids that when I was 4, my parents sat me down in front of the TV and had me watch Star Wars.
Oh,
Uh,
nice.
so just really early on, I whether it just had a natural affinity to it or was exposed to sorry, exposed to stories, was just drawn to 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 stories in general, TV and movies mostly, 'cause that's more absorbable when you don't know how to read. But as a kid, I know how to read now, just to just to clarify.
No, of course.
Um, but um, but I feel super duper lucky because like the Saturday morning cartoons that I grew up with,
Yeah.
I think were exceptional and they were really good stories. Whether it was Avatar: The Last Airbender
Yep.
or even things like Digimon. Like I go back
Yes.
and think about season 1 and 2 of Digimon. Like these are really well told stories for the most.
Mhm.
They fall off here or there. Um, and so over the years, one of the first books I ever read was The Neverending Story. You can't see it, but there's a
Mm.
folio edition behind me that's gorgeous with illustrated
You
pages.
you're holding out on us.
Yeah, here, let me see
No,
if
you
I
don't have to, you don't.
but that story had a really big impact on me, which I didn't realize at the time when I was 6 when I read it. I read it again
Mm.
like in my early 20s, but it
Oh,
kind of
wow.
goes into detail about the power of story and the power of imagination, which sounds very much like the power of friendship, and level
Mm.
up and beat the final boss. But more importantly, like to me, stories are how we understand the world, and how we see the world, and how we learn lessons and truths that are truer than nonfiction in a way.
Mm.
Nonfiction, which I do read a good amount of, is great for learning, tangible functional things. But if you want to learn how to be noble and how to
Mm.
be brave, yeah, even if you want to learn the power of friendship, but if you
Yeah.
want to, I don't know, Bo, to answer your question, I watched Saved by the Bell too, so we're in good company. But if you want to learn kind of abstract lessons,
Mhm.
that is we're wired to do that through stories. And so kind of reflecting as I was writing, and part of what I wanted to do with this book was number one, build a world like the worlds I got to live in, right?
Mm.
Like Star Wars, like Back to the Future, like Avatar, like all the video games I love to play, something that people can think on and be and live in and to a degree, but also, create a story that had depth and meaning, that not could teach people lessons, but help people discover or learn like people are going to take out of a story, whatever is relevant to them,
Mhm.
as long as there's enough depth. So I kind of fell in love with the over the process of writing and over the process of studying for the last decade storytelling. I fell in love with the art of and craft of storytelling, and
Mm.
the more so than I fell in love with writing. I do love to write, but
Right.
writing is a means to tell fantastic stories.
Mm. That's a beautiful way to convey it. And in terms of just to add to it, in terms of those childhood stories that we grew up with, I wasn't a huge reader, especially when I was like under 8, 10 or 8. But I still remember very fondly and in great detail. I don't know if anyone watched this show. It was by Disney, and it was really dark for Disney, but it was gargoyles,
Yeah, it's a great,
right?
fantastic show. Yeah,
And it's also the long haul, right? Because the story goes on over the course of what, years?
yeah,
With the characters, you see their relationships develop, the plots that are just constantly coming up for these characters and their continual um, survival, not even just survival, but their progression through it all and their growth. And for me, that was the fascinating part as a kid was seeing a story go beyond one book, one like 200-page book or like a short story or something for little kids, right? But yeah, if anyone else has some gargoyle love, I'd love to.
yeah. I mean, I'm biased, obviously, but I do think that there was something special about TV in like the 90s,
Mhm.
early 2000s, that and listen, I'm not watching Saturday morning cartoons anymore. I don't have the
We
luxury
should be.
to be wrong. But like I think back to, you know, even like Justice League and
Yes.
all of those shows, like even Metabots, Power Rangers Time Force, which was one
Yep.
season of a television of Power Rangers, obviously. But I go back and I was curious and I reread the season description. I was like, this is an incredibly intricate plot for a season of Power Rangers.
Right?
Um, yeah, I think especially for kids, they're for me at least, there's
Mm,
so I got really angry at Sesame Street and other kid shows when I was a kid
okay.
because I was like, this is boring. You're not engaging me with enough. So I don't know if just it was bred into me at an early age, but you know,
Mm,
something about seeing an arc and story and character development always spoke to me. Um,
right.
so later in life, this has been a really great way to indulge that obsession, I suppose.
No, I love to hear it, and I agree, like, I grew up with the '90s cartoons, and I remember the original, now they're doing a reboot or a continuation of it, the X-Men '97. I
Yeah.
remember watching that too, right? So, we had some pretty good cartoons, but, hello, I know we already talked with Bo's question, but welcome, Bo, always good to see you. You have a demand of you, Sam.
Yes, I am working hard on book 2. I will tell you, Bo, the outline is about a third complete, and it's already 15,000 words. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
the outline.
That's
Uh,
good progress.
so I am working on book 2, and um, I will also tell your audience that I do have a secret project that I just hit a big milestone today. So hopefully that will
Congrats.
be in people's hands in a reasonable time.
Okay.
It won't be next month, but it will be relatively soon.
So, just in terms of where people can follow you to get updates on that, where can people hear more about that as details are available?
Yeah, so Instagram, at Elements of Time Book, Twitter. I don't know my Twitter handle. I think it's S Paisley Author.
I think it is. Yeah.
And then my website is elementsoftime.ca, but Instagram is probably where I'm most active. But you can hit me up on any of those, and I will um, I will likely answer because I check them all incessantly. Probably too much.
It's the curse of social media.
Yeah.
Hello and welcome, American student. Good to have you here. Yes, we got some Digimon love. Always love to see it. So in terms of we talked about a few stories and a few things that you loved. Elmo is not one of them. We've learned. In terms of your top 3 stories, no matter format, which ones would you pick?
Ooh, that's tough. Um, it's very, very tough. So I will say one video game that it's probably my if I had to pick one video game, one all-time classic, and it exploded my brain when I played it as a kid. It is the first JRPG I've ever played. So I had no idea that video game plots could be so intricate and
Mm.
long and beautiful. Um, Skies of Arcadia. It
Oh, okay.
the remake for the GameCube is called Skies of Arcadia Legends. It was originally a Dreamcast game, the short-lived Dreamcast. So
Oh, interesting.
It is I mean, obviously the graphics are not going to hold up to today's standard, but it's a stunning game with a beautiful story and an incredible magic system, and something that just, again, it exploded my 12-year-old brain because I didn't know video games could do this. So that
Right.
one's super powerful. I have to say the Neverending Story because my
Yep.
wife can likely hear me, and if I don't say it, then so it was that our first dance was the Neverending Story. We bonded very much when we first met over that.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So that's probably the most impactful book of all time. I'm trying to pick one from different mediums because I think that's the most egalitarian way to do it. And then as far as I'm torn, but I think Back to the Future is
Okay.
is probably another one in terms of um, the the storytelling, the fun, the ambiance.
Mm.
It was made in 1985 and somehow perfectly captured the essence of that decade, which is very hard to do while you're in a time period.
Yes.
It almost feels like referencing 80s movies, but it was creating the genre while it was doing it. So um, and I've always just loved time travel as a concept, and Back to the Future does it pretty well. I
Okay.
mean, there's you can poke holes in most things, but for what it is, yeah,
Mm.
those I think are a good encompassing field of my favorite stories.
Well, just to add to that, because I've come across this too, and when reviewing books and stuff, I can still love something absolutely, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah,
Plot holes and issues, don't care. It made me feel things, and it made me happy and had fun. So I think you can kind of squish those things to the side and
yeah. There's a
enjoy
distinction
it.
between is it super high quality and do I love it? You know,
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And, yes, ZK so the Gargoyles show has quite a few voice actors that originally did Star Trek: The Next Generation,
huh.
which is a lo they yeah, so for the voice actors, some of the main characters
Yeah,
too that you
Riker
see.
was Riker, I think,
Yep,
the villain?
Xanatos.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, Demona was Deanna
Oh,
Troy, that actress. So there's quite a few in there.
good to know.
Yeah, which is, as a Trekkie, it's fun. But Bo says that there is a new adaptation for the Neverending Story coming out.
Oh, well, I'll have to either give it a try or absolutely pretend it doesn't exist, I guess, depending on the quality.
I feel like that's where most people are at nowadays with adaptations. So, outside of stories, outside of writing, what else do you spend your time doing?
Yeah, I mean, right now, that is that's probably the biggest thing, but I do have a dog, so, taking care of her. I when I moved into this house, there's a backyard and I have a little bit of a garden, so I've gotten into gardening over the last couple years, but
Oh, lovely.
yeah, which is not it's funny. When I was a kid, my dad would garden all the time and be like, "Do you want to join me?" And I'm like, "Never, never in a million years. Why would I ever want to do that?" And now it's become like an obsession of mine.
Get my
Um,
gardening gloves.
yeah, last year was crazy because so in the span of from May till October, I left the job I'd been at for 5 years to go to a new company, and then got laid off within a week, and then proposed a week after
Gosh.
that to plan a wedding. This was June, to plan a wedding for October. Launched the book in July whilst job hunting to start a new job in September, and then get married. So and then this year, I'm traveling like crazy for work, working on the secret projects, and then trying to spend time with my wife and and have a life. So the uh, the amount of extra time I have outside of stories right now is quite limited. Uh,
Mm.
but in terms of things I like to do, um, have a very simple life. I like to garden, I like to play video games, I like to exercise when I can, and then I like to take naps. Those are like
I
if I
mean, that sounds like a dream to me, you know? Play video games, garden, just do things you love and then sleep.
Yep. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work out that way, but, once every couple weeks, you can sneak one of those things in there, and,
Get a surprise nap in.
yeah.
Welcome, Daniel. Good to have you here. Daniel says, I need to reread the book of the never-ending
It's
story. I was a kid when I read it.
it's so good, Daniel, and it has a completely different meaning, when you're older than when you're younger. You can it's one of the few books where the ending I am a sucker, stone cold sucker for father-son relationships, in stories. It may be why Star Wars resonates with me so well, but, it's one of the few books every time I get to the end, I'm like, "Okay, let's brace ourselves." So yes, absolutely recommend rereading it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And Daniel also says, I'm the exact same way. Gardening is the last thing I would have ever been interested in as a kid. And now I can't wait for it to get warm enough to grow stuff every year. I love it. So I grew up with my grandfather being a horticulturalist.
Oh, wow.
And so he had an acre garden full of fruits and vegetables
Wow.
every year. So as a kid, I spent my summers and my weekends running through that garden and helping. So for me, it's like second nature, right? It's like my home away from home.
That's awesome. I'm very jealous. I think a life goal, well, we're in Canada, so you know how unrealistic this is, but would be to get enough space to have a riding lawnmower.
Oh,
That would
yes.
be that's like I know I've made it when I need
Ye
to cut the grass
get
with
get that acre and then
yeah,
you're good. Yeah, I just love to see the appreciation for gardening, and yes, it's hard to get, some space around your home nowadays. So, I will put it to the chat. If you have questions for Sam, by all means, pop them in. We will be getting to those. Hello, Mike. Always great to see you. Welcome. I want to be able to yell at at kids to get off my lawn. Does that count as gardening? Yes,
yeah, that
by
counts.
all means. Get a hose and water that grass while they're running, you know? So while we are waiting for those questions to come in, let's dig a little deeper into your writing and your book because I have questions. I always
Yes.
have questions, but I've got questions. So at one point, did you say, yeah, you know what? I want to write my own story. And when did this concept for the world come into play?
Yes, so I, in university, was considering going into film. I
Oh,
was in a
interesting.
business program, but I'd always loved stories and particularly movies. As you can tell, all of my reference none of my references are books. But that's just because early on in life I was not an avid reader. But so I wanted to go into film. Long story short, I decided that was not a viable long-term career path, and I decided to go the business route. And my thinking was twofold. Number one, I wanted to learn how to communicate better, to speak better, and I figured writing was the best way to do that, uh,
Mm,
to get ideas from your brain into actual physical form. And number two, it's the lowest barrier to entry way to create a story, right? As long as you
interesting.
have a means of writing, then you can create something. You don't need film camera, you don't need a camera, you don't need equipment. You just need to be able to write. Um, America, Bo and American Student.
Yeah.
Literally, as soon as I can find someone to to make it, I've been researching how to do that. So hopefully soon.
We need these pets. I saw the pictures. They're adorable.
So the concept of the story. This is okay. I don't recommend anyone do what I did. This is the recipe for taking 10 years to write your book.
The amount of times I've heard this before an author explains something is I'm gonna have to start giving myself $1 every time.
Basically, I had the idea for the ending of book one. So if anyone's read book one and you know exactly the scene I'm talking about, and I knew that I wanted to have an elemental magic system.
Mm.
Um, and I've always just loved the 4 Greek elements in just as a magic system in general. So I basically formed the world around like 1 or 2 key scenes and then wrote the entire thing in a month with no prior writing experience. It is trash. It is absolute it doesn't I was figuring it out as I was writing in just the
Mm.
most clumsy. If this book ever becomes like the next whatever Harry Potter, Game of Thrones, Bible, best-selling book of all time, um, then I will possibly release that first draft just so people can see, anyone can do it.
Verbal contract will hold, yes.
Yeah, exactly. But essentially, my process was writing the book 6 times to figure out the world. And what I learned from that was that I understand ideas better by writing them. So what that
Interesting.
turned into over time was a detailed way of, I guess, writing in note form what chapters and scenes will be. And as
Mm.
I do that, so like for example, for book 2, so my basic plan is I'm writing chapter by chapter and scene by scene within those chapters, what will happen in point form notes. And as I do that, new ideas come to the forefront and are fleshed out more. So literally
Interesting.
my notes will look like Cooper does this, Reed does this, other character does this. I'm just using names that are in book 1. They may or may not be in book 2. And I'm like, oh, what if this person does this? And I'll write myself a note and be like, maybe this is the idea for how this happens. And so instead of drafting an entire book, it's
Mm.
figure out these ideas. I'm writing it out in point form and building the world around it.
That's fascinating though, because then you're giving yourself, an outline as you do it, right? You're building your outline essentially as you're writing it, and then you're cleaning it up as you go.
Exactly.
Mm.
And in terms of like how the world around book 1 came to be, the my goal was to write as airtight of a story as I could in terms of plot holes and consistency. And so I really wanted to think through every action,
Mm.
every move a character makes, every bit of the magic system. And as you read through, you'll realize, particularly by the end, oh, there was a lot of pieces here that needed to make sense. I could
Mm.
have not, but it was really important to me that everything was extremely tight. And because of a lot of the interplay of characters and the magic system itself, it took a long time to conceptualize. And because of my writing process, unfortunately, that meant me writing a bunch of things that didn't end up going into the book just so I could understand how it worked.
So, keeping that in mind with book 2, how do you separate and keep all of that organized, right, in terms of the plot? Because you have things that you didn't use.
Yeah.
Did you, like, are they stuck in your brain, but you have them noted not to use them?
Um, it For the most part, because I've been obsessing over this for 10 years, a lot of it stays up here
Okay.
compartmentalized pretty well. Um, but the stuff that I didn't use, like I know kind of the things I've developed that contradict. And
Mm.
then unfortunately what does happen sometimes is I will write in my outline, what if we did this? And then I have to sit for like half an hour and be like, okay, does this
Oh.
contradict? How does it work? But
Yeah.
my theory of writing is, oh, I forget who said this. I don't remember if it was the creator of Zelda, The Legend of Zelda, not the name Zelda, or which game, but um, basically, if you rush something out, then it's bad forever.
Mm.
Is if you take the
Yeah.
extra time to make it great, then it's great forever. I'm paraphrasing, but
Mm, yes. No, I think it is, the founder of Nintendo
yeah.
that yeah.
So it obviously, so book 2, just for anyone who's wondering, is not going to take 10 years. There's a plan to get it out much sooner than that, and I'm working around my work schedule. But if it takes the extra 6 months to get it to where it should be, to where readers
Mm.
deserve to be. I'd rather take that time and that effort to really think through. Like the last thing I would want is for so you're as you mentioned early on in the book, there's about
Mhm.
an inciting incident, and the reasoning behind that inciting incident took me about 7 years to figure out. Um,
Jeez.
it won't hopefully feel that way,
No,
but
no, but it's like to me, I just that was shocking. Like 7 years to get that. That's so much time.
yeah, and it's because there was a level of quality, and again, this relates to
Mm,
the themes and the depths of storytelling and how much I care about storytelling and what I want to give to the whoever decides to pick up the book, that it needed to it needed to all fit. The puzzle pieces needed to fit, and I wasn't going
right.
to compromise until it did. And I'm thrilled with the result. Like if
Yeah.
it's funny. Before I published my then fiance, now wife, not we haven't broke up since, but um, I remember one time she woke up in the middle of the night, just visibly upset, and I was like, "What's wrong?" She's like, I just had a dream. Like, if you pass away, I don't know how to publish your book. I don't know.
Oh,
Like,
God. Aw,
like it's that shouldn't be your biggest concern, but like
she
that's
was all in.
exactly. So, um,
Oh.
I wanted to give that level of care and attention. So, like, if this is the only thing I ever end up producing, then I'm thrilled with how it ended up turning out.
Well, first of all, that's that's admirable, right? Not only to sit down, take the time to put your story. You spent all that time, all those drafts, but then good on you for sticking it out and keeping that encouragement up because the motivation, I mean, that must have been hard to find some days.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I think the biggest, when I talk about the timeline for book one, the biggest thing is just turning it into a discipline as opposed to motivation. So it's just like going to the gym.
Hmm,
You don't necessarily want to do it all
interesting.
the time. But what I found is the more consistent I would write, the easier, the stronger the muscle was, right? The easier it was to get back
Right.
into it. The more I could remember, and I came up with a system around it. Um, but that's also, I was fortunate that I did this all in my 20s, right? Like
Right.
I'm 31 now, I'm married, I'm hopeful to have kids and all these other responsibilities. And so you don't have the luxury of, I'm going to take, you know, 3 to 6 months to focus on something right now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little harder when you have kids. You're like, "Okay, I've got 2 hours of pure exhaustion.
Yeah.
What can I do?" So, and, American Student here says that's an interesting idea, maybe a bunch of spin-offs based off the alternative theories.
Yeah, so I think like if I had infinite time, there is a very easy full prequel book, not even, well, I guess prequel book, but like entire full length story that I could easily write.
Mm,
And not to mention other spin-off stories with characters in between before all that kind of stuff. I do have to pick and choose the stories that I want to tell just on the basis of time, but
right.
there hopefully, for whoever picks up the book, whoever read it or has read it, you can see that there's a lot that isn't, sorry, excuse me, that isn't told in the story. Not to say that it's like you're not left with a billion questions as to how anything works,
Mm,
but um, there is chronologically, like let's say, so this book, let's say, takes place in 2009. There are approximately 14.5 billion years worth of lore that happened before that. So there's a lot.
Bo says, "Sam, I'm old. Don't take too long to write the rest."
It'll be somewhere between Brandon Sanderson timelines and George R. R. Martin timelines. That's my promise.
I see you chose the safe bet there, the safe timeline. So in terms of, this is your debut. It is your first book out in a trilogy. You chose to go for a chunker of a book. Was that the original plan?
No, again, I don't recommend doing what I did. This was far too big of a mountain to climb. Um, I think it's like 600 something
It's
pages.
it's 600 pages or so, yeah.
Yeah.
Just
So
under.
I I remember as I was writing this, actively thinking, I am I have written so much. Like, I know what part of the story I'm in, and I know how is there still 100,000 words left to write? It wasn't the intention, and the entire so none of my family or friends are really genre readers. Uh,
Mm,
and my dad is very much like he'll read a book in a day. It's like a trade paperback, like one you'd pick up at the airport, and just like a Grisham
right.
thing. Read it in a day and just not remember it all. But like that's not why
Yeah.
he reads. He reads and he's like, the side is like it's a lot to take in and the whole time I was like, I am telling the story that I need to tell, and it has
Yeah.
the details that it needs in it, and I have to trust that there are genre readers out there who are going to like it. And fortunately, there are.
Mhm.
And I am one of them, so I knew that there were. But um, it was definitely one of those things where, like, I don't know if you remember the episode of The Simpsons where Homer he starts working out, and then the applesauce bar people have him try to climb the Matterhorn.
Yes.
He's climbing up and he makes it to the top and he looks up and all of a sudden the clouds clear and there's like an entire additional mountain. So
Yeah.
that's very much what it felt like.
Yeah.
But um but obviously, like, in retrospect, I'm so glad I did it. Um the draft that I sent my editor, like draft 6, was about 265,000 words. And she came back and was like, and I
Oh,
told her she's absolutely phenomenal. She actually edited Adrian Tchaikovsky's The Children of Time,
oh, wow.
was the original title of my series, and I was like, well, this is ironic, but I'm going to change it because the S
Right.
not not work to my advantage. But so I told her, I was like, look, tell me what I can cut, but at the end of the day, I wrote the story as long as it needed to be to fit in the elements that it needed to have. Um,
Right.
and she's like, okay, well, here's, how you can blah, blah, blah. And then for draft 7, when I was editing, I went in with a scalpel. I was like, I'm going to take out every single, even if it's one word a page, I'm going to take out every unnecessary word that I can. I'm going to shorten every sentence that I can. And I just
Interesting.
went in and like was surgical, and I ended up eliminating like 35,000 words.
Wow.
So,
That's impressive.
yeah, so it was not my intention to ever write a long book. I think the reason it has the length that it does is because I want it to be so airtight. And
Right.
so I kept thinking about like, oh, I need this scene to explain this. And then every scene that I put in also had to build character and had to drive the plot forward. Those were like my two rules.
Right.
Had to do either of those things, but preferably both. And so it just kept snowballing into a longer and longer story.
So, with that in mind, what would you say the overall pacing is on the final book, the final product?
Yeah, it's really designed to be a fun, relatively fast-paced book. Like
Okay.
it's I would say probably medium pacing, like on a scale from 1 to 10, maybe 6.5.
Okay.
There's definitely a slower burn at the beginning, which is intentional. As you said before we started
Mm.
streaming, there's a jarring jump from prologue to chapter 1, and chapter 1 is very much meant to feel like a teen comedy. Like it's
Mhm.
meant to feel fun and cozy and low stakes, and then uh, it kind of slaps you over the head as you jump out of that world. But um, then from there, every single like it's a relatively slow burn to the end because it's long. But every
Right.
single chapter is meant, not every single chapter, most chapter it's an adventure, action adventure book.
Right.
So it's not you're not it doesn't really focus on like political intrigue or people scheming. There is a lot of scheming, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is like be fun, have interesting stakes, have an interesting world, and be really engaging. And then at the end, you're like, oh, wow, okay, I need to now reread it from chapter one because I must have missed a lot of stuff.
Oh, I love it. And Brighton, welcome. Good to see you. Thank you so much for stopping in. And Daniel coming in with some wisdom here, a very small range of time, depending on your point of view. For example, compared to the age of the universe. I'm if I'm lucky to get 80 years, that's like a blip in that time, in that perspective of the universe. But beautifully said. So I'm going to put it to the chat again. If you have any questions for Sam, pop them in. We will cover those as well. So full transparency, I still have so many questions, and we're like 15 minutes to the hour. So I'm going to try and filter these best I can. But I feel like we have to do some justice to these creatures that look adorable on your website. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yes. So I'll also answer Bo's question quickly.
Yes,
That's
please.
pronounced that's like the first name you introduce you. It's pronounced Sophoris. Um,
Okay.
it's from I'm also gonna try to shorten all of my answers for you, Kay. I realize I talk a lot.
Oh no, it's good.
It's
I love it.
it comes from the Greek word meaning sophrazine, meaning moderation, temperance, a whole bunch of other good stuff, and
Oh,
the
interesting.
Hebrew word sefer, meaning book. So Sophoris. Yes, the Spritas. So without spoiling too much, they are integral to the magic system. They are essentially animal companions, kind of baby form of elementals, um, heavily inspired by Pokemon. I
I
grew
love
up
it.
with Pokemon. I love Pokemon. So they are um, all of the ones that you see in this book at least are when they are kind of, I don't want to say born, it's not the right word, but awakened. They all have the same base form, which is basically like
A
a
little ball.
yeah. And then from there, the individual kind of identifiers. So like the spirit of air looks like a little bird. So it has it like imagine like the head of a snowy owl, like big round eyes, little beak, wings, but a ball, little talons. And then the spirit of fire is more fox-like. Um,
Mm,
so big, kind of again, big eyes, little fox ears, orange. And
different plumage.
yes, um, and so basically, yeah, they're integral to the yeah, that's yeah, cute balls
Cute
fan.
ball. Yeah, cute ball of animals of death.
They're integral to the magic system. In fact, they are in many ways the magic system.
Mm,
So again, without getting into too much detail and over explaining, they they are the embodiments of their they're the embodiments of what they represent in the universe. So the spirit of air represents movement. So all magic related to that, or all abilities related to that.
nice.
And they are kind of animal companions to certain characters in the book, and are incredibly powerful. And yeah, cute balls of animal death is a good way to describe.
That's your next sales pitch. Book features cute ball animals of death. So, in terms of, and this can be human type characters or the creatures, what was your favorite character to write?
I think my favorite character to write is Pax.
Okay.
I can't say his role in the book because it will
No, that's fair. You can
ruin.
go without context if
Yeah.
you want.
But he is very much the I would say the most dynamic character in terms of you don't really know what his motivations are. He knows what his motivations are, but the reader doesn't. And it really allowed me to play him a lot of different ways in a lot of different chapters. And it was always his voice always felt the easiest to slip into for whatever reason, whatever part of my brain
Okay.
it was touching. But
Interesting.
and I think he's just in general the most fun and probably the richest character in terms of theme and backstory and history.
Oh, okay. Well, I think I've met Pax very briefly, but that makes sense. That makes sense. And for anyone who is watching now or later, if you do want to see a little visual of those cute ball animals of death, they are in the link in the description to Sam's website. He has some concept art there for you to peruse. So if you want to see what we're talking about and why these little balls of birds and creatures are so adorable, then that's your go-to. So in terms of the lore, the plot, and what I can only imagine in this chunker is foreshadowing. How did you tackle that? Because like you said, you wanted to make sure everything was so clean, it was airtight. Did you you did your outline, you write everything out. Did you try and keep track of all of it in an Excel sheet to boot?
I did. I tried to use Campfire.
Okay.
Shout out to Campfire if you're looking for people to sponsor. Um, it became just an exercise in documentation at a certain point. Like I didn't find it overly helpful. Um,
Okay.
what I did was because I had written the book like 6 times, it was
Mm,
so implanted in my brain. I would fall asleep thinking about these things and like in my free time be thinking about them. So um, I didn't have as good of a system as I should have to figure it all out. A
right.
lot of it was reading and rereading what I wrote to remind myself. But what I think ended up happening was because I wanted everything to be so airtight, the logic behind everything made such intrinsic sense to me that it became easy to remember.
Okay.
But a lot of that was also just pure it's almost like knowing the lyrics to a song that you've listened to 1,000 times. Like at a certain
Right.
time, it just becomes part of who you are in the back of your head.
Has that changed at all with book 2?
Um, Not particularly because the book two really is a character progression. Um,
Okay.
and so like book two is such a complete sequel to book one in every sense of the word, where
Mm,
story is a direct continuation. It's a little bit later in time, a couple years later, but what was set up in book one was so explicit. Like the next thing that would happen in book two is in many ways an inevitability. So book one and two are very much almost one full story. The
okay.
magic system is the exact same, the plotting is the exact same, and part of what made the
Right.
plotting for book one so difficult is that I knew how book two was going to happen, and I had to make sure that it integrated properly.
Wow, okay. You've got quite the hard drive up here for for
I
memory.
had to push out a lot of other stuff. Like I cannot for the life of me remember anyone's birthday anymore. But
Oh, what that's what calendars on your phone are for nowadays. So you're also part of the Break-ins, which is a group of debut authors. And I would just love to know how that, if at all, has impacted your writing compared to when you originally started.
yeah, I would say it hasn't much other than it's really nice to have a community of people to keep you
Mm.
going. So it's certainly impacted my spirit and motivation because there's about 15, 16 of us, and we have a calendar of events, and like every 2 weeks it seems like someone's releasing something. So it's a lot, but it's also very inspiring to just be part of a group. And even if like um you know I'm like, oh, I'm having trouble doing, like I had a really big mental hurdle jumping into book two because I was like, I don't know if I can keep climbing that mountain. It's terrifying. And
Yeah.
basically just kind of everyone in the group was like, just do whatever you can. Do write one
Mm,
word. And I was like, okay. And then I'm like, wrote 2,000 words of the outline today, and we all celebrate each other. So
that's
um
amazing.
yeah, it really, like, in terms of, we all have such different styles and different
Mm.
lives, but having a group to rely on where everyone understands the struggle is, I can't thank everyone enough basically for the support.
That's amazing. I love that you all come together to support one another, but I imagine it's also a form of accountability in a way as well, right? Because you're sharing your updates and stuff like that. So you're not only getting that little boost, but Getting that little reminder on your shoulder saying, "Hey, you getting your word counts? You getting your story out?"
Exactly.
So, I know you've done quite a few interviews so far, and I would love to know what's something that you would love to chat about that hasn't come up yet in an interview?
Uh, ooh, um, I I think that we don't necessarily like something I've never really dived that far into is just the how we can use stories and like how to teach interpreting stories, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like
Mm,
how to part of what I've always wanted to do is like I've always wanted to be a teacher and I would love for this book to like I think it's perfect for let's say high school students who don't really appreciate English, but something that was so impactful to me was just one course in university where the prof really taught me how to interpret and read stories and the stuff that I was innately gravitating to, you know, in those Saturday
mm,
morning cartoons and the depth of story. I learned how to put formal thought to.
right.
Um, and that's something I would love to see more is, you know, everyone in the book community obviously loves stories, but I'd love
Mhm,
to see people be able to develop and fine tune their tools to actually talk about why and understand
mm,
the um, the craft of storytelling from a reader's perspective without having to write anything at all, but just
mm,
understand like this is an actually well crafted and written story, and this maybe isn't, but here's why I love it anyways. Here are the elements that I can take from it that I love, and you know, a lot of the reviews that I see, not for mine. Everyone who's ever reviewed my book is perfect. Um, but, but in general, like when people are talking about books, it's rarely the craft of the story. It's usually a high level emotional feeling, which is
mhm.
that's great. That is what stories are meant to do. But I would love to talk more with people and help people develop the understanding of the craft behind it. And I'm biased. That's what I love to talk about anyways.
Well, no,
Uh,
I appreciate that because as like a reviewer, I've been reviewing books for years, even my before my booktube channel actually started. And learning how to review was a whole process for me, right? Because starting out, it was like, book good. Yeah,
yeah.
read, please read this book. I enjoyed it very much. And being able to articulate why you like something, not just from the emotional sense, but what in a craft sense, a reader doesn't necessarily have that knowledge base on what makes a good story craft wise. So I appreciate that. So in terms of is that something you would want to set up?
Yeah. I mean, like my like imaginary future self, I'd love to be like teaching a university or high school English course on on storytelling and on stories. And I don't know, like it's not something I would have the time to set up necessarily right now. But to teach that kind of like I love to teach in general,
Mm,
or to be involved in something like that in some sort of way. But there is so much depth to like there's a reason that Star Wars, you know, a movie that came out in
right.
1977, can be watched today and appreciated and loved and resonate. And obviously there's superficial reasons as to like it's fun and entertaining to watch and lightsabers are cool and Jedi are awesome and Han Solo is slick. Like,
Yeah.
yes, don't get me wrong, that's all fantastic. Um, but I mean that's the obvious example of George Lucas being a student of Joseph Campbell, who was a student of Carl
Mm,
Jung and the monomyth and all that kind of stuff. Um, but I think there's so much that can be derived and so much meaning that can be derived from understanding the
mm.
elements of a story. Like when I it's funny, my wife loves Harry Potter, one of the people who grew up obsessed with them. I've actually never read the books, but I know a
Unacceptable.
yeah,
No, kidding.
I know. However,
Kidding.
I know a crazy amount about all the stories because I've studied the craft of them. So, like, when she talks about, let's say,
Right.
Chamber of Secrets, she's like, "Yeah, it was like this is what I love, whatever." And I'm like, "Well, let me tell you about the here's the metaphors that she's laying out, and Hogwarts is society, and then you have the snake and the Garden of Eden, like all of these things." She's like, "Whoa, I thought you didn't read this book. Like, what are you talking about?" So, um, there's so much depth in these stories that resonate with us, and it's something that I would love to be a part of eventually, but if not, I think it's something that at the very least people should think about or think about things.
Mm. So in terms of until that day comes, if it comes, where can people, if they're interested in learning more about the writing craft, is there any resources, anything that you would recommend they check out in the meantime?
Yeah, I would say the the place where I started was John Truby's Anatomy of a Story.
Okay.
It's a very digestible book on writing. Like a lot of people, recommend Skin the Cat, and other books like that. I found John Truby's book to be the most impactful resource to me.
Mhm.
And that's really a book for people who want to write, but you can definitely learn a lot. I mean, it is to me a seminal piece in the art of storytelling.
Right.
And it talks about things like how how to set up your um, things like your protagonists and your antagonists against them and what they should represent, and
Mm.
what the purpose of dialogue is, and what he calls symphonic dialogue, which is dialogue that is speaking on multiple different levels at the same time, right? So if you have two
Right.
characters talking to one another, it's not just like the first level would be they're having a conversation. The second level would be they're having a conversation that obviously is relevant to the story, it's progressing the story. But symphonic dialogue is characters that are talking to each other, that are talking about the story. It's progressing the story. You're understanding both of their perspectives more as a contrast to one another.
Yeah.
And they're talking about something that is more important outside of the context of the story, within the story, but also life in general. So
Right.
it's, that's something that you can't do in every single conversation, but that's when your dialogue becomes really meaningful and
Mm.
people can take a lot out of. Again, that's when the story becomes more real than nonfiction, right? Is
Right.
where it has that meaning beyond the story itself. And again, like there's so many stories out there that are really well written that people might not love, and stories that are not well written that people might love, but understanding why or why not, to me, is a fascinating subject.
I love it. And in terms of like from a reader perspective, and I mean just in general, I find the more you learn about something, whether it's a artistic craft or anything like that, the more you appreciate it as well,
Absolutely.
right? You have a higher appreciation for it, and in terms of dialogue, not only are you like my brain just goes, not only do you need to make all of that work with the dialogue example you gave, you also have to make it sound natural and not completely stale and like
Yeah.
a staged conversation.
Yeah, I think my favorite trope, like when I'm like, oh, this person needs help, is the as you know dialogue, where it's
Okay.
as you know, Sam, if we don't stop the ship from doing blah blah blah, then it's like, well, yeah, I already know it. Why are you
Yeah.
you're telling me to tell me off? But yeah, like that type of, and again, as a reader, that might not be something that you care about, or like I'm saying this is from a place of complete bias because I've spent so much time writing, but I do think that there is merit, even in people understanding why they like something, just so that you can
Mm.
talk about it to other people. Where it's like, hey,
Yeah.
this is my favorite TV show. Why? It's cool. Like that's not it.
Yeah. Lightsabers. No, that's fair, and I mean, in terms of getting those discussions, you and whoever you're discussing that with, you can really jive with that conversation when you get 2 people who love the book that they're talking about or the movie that they're talking about. I think it gets a little heated when you have someone who really loved it and someone who maybe did not,
Yeah,
and they're heated in the sense of they're both trying to make their case, right?
Exactly.
You can have a completely different conversation if they're both like, "Ah, okay, appreciate that you didn't, you know, get that or you didn't like that." But when two people go at it and they're like, "No, let me explain to you why."
Yeah, and it's also it becomes an elevated conversation too when, like,
Mm,
if you're just going at like, let's say I love my book and you hate it, and I'm just like, "It was the best book ever," and you're like, "It's the
yeah.
worst book ever." You don't That's not a conversation, you're just fighting, right? But
Yeah,
if you talk to, "Well, here are the thematic elements that he did really well, and here's what it spoke to me on," and you're like, "Okay, that's great, but from a plotting perspective, here are all the issues and blah, 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 blah." Then
right.
it becomes a real conversation over, like, you're talking to you're not just fighting with someone. You can have a
Right.
conversation.
You're not having a debate about it, you're having an actual in-depth conversation. No, I appreciate that. And Daniel here says, "My reviews are always me going off on a tangent about something related to the writing influences or something. If I mention a single character's name or anything about the plot, it's a miracle." I love it. I love it. It's everyone writes reviews differently, and I think it is fantastic because everyone's different. Everyone digests stories differently and then articulates it in a very personal way, just as the experience was reading for them. So before we close off for the evening, as I realize it is getting a bit late, I'll open up the floor for final questions from the chat. So, folks, if you have those questions, get those in now and we will cover them before we leave. While we wait for that, if you could give one piece of advice to an aspiring author, what would it be?
Discipline over motivation. So
Mm,
if writing is something that you really want to do, there's gonna be more times that you're not gonna want to do it than when you are, which is totally normal. But what has been most impactful for me and what I've seen to be most impactful for the people that I know has been training yourself to to do the work regardless of how you feel. So whether that means um, setting aside an hour a day or an hour a week or an hour a month, but it's scheduled, it's there, and just like any other commitment that you would have, if you had plans with a friend, if you had a doctor's appointment, you sit down at that time and do the work. That's going to get you a heck of a lot farther than waiting for the muse to strike, because in one instance you have control, in the other instance you don't. Um, and something I'll share just as a quote that stuck with me for a long time. People significantly overestimate what they can accomplish in a month and underestimate what they can accomplish in a year. So
right.
um, these things take time, but if you are disciplined and you commit yourself to doing something, watch what you can do in a year, because you will get much further than you would have thought possible.
I love that. I love that. And you're right. You can accomplish a lot more than a month and a year than a month because usually a month is when people will start to peter out or lose that drive or that motivation they originally had, right? And ZK here says, author you've always wanted to meet, living and or dead, up to you.
I mean, I think the obvious one is probably Tolkien. It's such an
Mhm.
impact on literature and an incredibly interesting life, obviously living through war and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, but I would say, um, in terms of, so Tolkien would be the author that I want to meet. Writer that I would want to meet, living or dead, would be Dan Harmon,
Okay.
creator of Community and Rick and Morty. I think he has, when I'm observing what he does with story,
Mm.
um, there are few that can do, like, I can barely articulate what he is able to do with story. So
I would love to hear your breakdown of it because Rick and Morty is just like a fever dream. That's so compelling.
yeah, so I mean, with Rick and Morty, we could talk a long time about this.
Yeah.
Really, where Dan Harmon uh, got me was with Community season 2 and 3 specifically. Was
Okay.
the best television I've ever seen. But with Rick and Morty, I think there's hit or miss episodes, but
Mhm.
if you look at like I've done a lot of research into Dan Harmon because I think he's incredibly talented. So a lot of what he puts into Rick and Morty is meta to his other like his opus in general. So like
Okay.
I appreciate that. But like if you look at the Story Train episode in maybe season 5, Dan Harmon
Yes.
spent a long time developing his formula for telling a perfect story, and it's basically like a circle method, which in that
Mhm.
case is basically the hero's journey. And that entire episode is making fun of him in that method whilst on the car and moving around. But throughout it, he's able to twist in an instant with incredible setups to different payoffs and completely
Mhm.
change the direction. And then you realize, oh, that entire setup was like a world's worth of setup that happened to make sense almost retroactively after the twist. And like I said, I can
Mhm.
barely even put into words. Like I'd have to sit down with a single episode and like analyze it and write out an essay.
No,
Um,
that's completely fair.
but how he does it is something I'd love
Mm.
to just study from him.
Oh, I love it. And let's see here. American Student asks other favorite books besides The Never Ending Story.
Huge fan of Ready Player One by Ernest Cline.
Yes.
I mean, the pop culture references alone are absolutely fantastic. But definitely a top story for me. Nonfiction, the book Quiet by I think Susan Cain. Um, that's from reading that book. I learned I was an introvert, and it developed my obsession with psychology. Um, Brave New World. I read 1984 and Brave New World back to back, and resonated far more with Brave New World by I think Aldous Huxley. Um, I always go blank. I should just look behind me where all my books are.
It's
Uh,
it's a problem. That's why we have the shelves.
um, and and then yeah, I think those are probably like top influences and top favorite books.
Okay. And Nicholas, welcome. He says, Sam, don't act like the real answer isn't
That
Keenan
is that
Love.
is the next author I plan to meet, dead or alive.
That's fantastic. And let's see. Bo here says, Sam, what book release in 2024 are you most excited for, excluding books from the break ins?
So I actually have earmarked all of my discretionary book money to Breakin's book this year because there are quite a few, and I don't have unlimited resources. But this is going to sound like a silly answer because it has nothing to do with science fiction, fantasy, or anything. But I just finished reading a really good sales book, and there's this, and I am in sales, and there's a I guess sequel coming out on sales leadership. And I just finished this book today, so it's
Oh,
just
wow.
super topical that this other one's coming out. So I'm not going to do a plug for the book because it's not really relevant. But I think if it were a couple months ago, I would have said the final book of the Skyward series, but I just finished those as well. So right now, I guess kind of a cop out answer because all the series I've read or was reading have finished, and all the books that I'm planning to read are Breakin's books for the foreseeable future. But other than that, it's this uninteresting sales book that
I mean that hey, that's all right, right? You gotta be excited for the books you're excited to read. That
exactly.
that that's what we're all here for. We're here to just go and chat about our excitement and passion for books, no matter their genre. All right. Well, with that, I will say thank you to everyone watching, and for you, Sam, thank you so much for your time this evening. For all of you watching, be sure, whether it's now or later, go check out the links in the description below to find the Elements of Time, the website that we talked about with the artwork, everything, including I believe the social media links are there as well. If you'd like to follow Sam, by all means, go check those out. And as always, everyone, thank you for watching and take care of yourselves.